The day had started like any other, a little chaotic, a little predictable. I was up before the sun, as usual, sipping my first cup of coffee while the house was still quiet. I always loved this time of morning. It was the only moment in my day when I could gather my thoughts and prepare for the whirlwind that was my life. I'm 39, a mother of two, juggling work, chores, school events, and everything in between. I've been through a lot bad relationships, financial struggles, career setbacks, but I always managed to keep things together. For the most part, I was proud of how far I'd come. But as the years wore on, I started to feel invisible. Maybe it was because I gave so much of myself, whether it was to my kids, my friends, or my ex-husband, that I lost track of who I was or what I needed. The worst part? I didn't know if anyone even noticed. I had always been a hands-on mom, and while it didn't come with the glamour I'd once imagined, it was what I knew best. My son Ethan was 25, now a young adult, trying to find his way in the world. We weren't a perfect family, far from it, but I always tried to be there for him, whether it was with his first heartbreak or a bad grade in college. We'd had our moments of tension, sure, but I thought we had a pretty solid relationship. He was my firstborn, after all. We shared something that was supposed to be sacred, a bond only a mother and her child could understand. I'd had Ethan when I was still figuring things out myself. I'd just turned 20, and though I loved him with everything I had to sacrifice a lot. The stability of my life came into question. Could I even provide for him? But somehow, I made it work. I'd worked endless hours as a waitress, scraped by with odd jobs, and stretched my paycheck as far as it could go. Ethan had grown up seeing his mother do whatever it took to keep the lights on, to keep food on the table, to give him a life that wasn't filled with struggle. I didn't give him everything he wanted, but I gave him what I could: love, security, and my time. Then there was Jamie, my younger daughter, a whirlwind of energy with a smile that could light up any room. She was 14 now, and while she wasn't quite the handful she used to be, she had this way of keeping me on my toes. The contrast between Ethan and Jamie was striking. Ethan was reserved, a bit quiet, often lost in his thoughts. Jamie, on the other hand, wore her heart on her sleeve and loved to be the center of attention. They balanced each other out in the most beautiful way, though sometimes I felt like Ethan's more quiet, withdrawn nature made him harder to read. He had a sensitivity to him that I couldn't always get past, and at times it felt like we were speaking different languages. We lived in a modest suburban home, the one I'd managed to pay off with the small savings I had left after my divorce. My ex Mike and I had split when Ethan was 17, and though the divorce was messy, I had held it together. I had no choice but to. Mike had been a good provider, but his drinking had slowly poisoned everything around him. I didn't need to be reminded of the emotional toll that had taken on me and the kids, so I picked up the pieces and carried on. Ethan had been more upset by the split than I'd expected, though he never really talked about it. But now, here we were. Ethan, a grown man with his own plans, his own life, and me, still trying to make sense of everything I had done and where I was. At times, it felt like I was invisible to him. Maybe it was the way I went about things, or maybe it was just life. He'd moved out a few years ago, and we hadn't seen each other as often as I'd hoped. Between his job, his social life, and his other obligations, he seemed to be drifting farther away. We didn't talk like we used to. Maybe that was just a part of life's natural progression, but it didn't sit well with me. But what really stung was the growing sense that I wasn't enough for him anymore. He had always been somewhat independent, but lately I noticed a shift. There were times I felt like I was becoming more of a background character in his story, no longer a central figure. He'd texted less frequently, called only when it was convenient, and every visit home felt like an obligation rather than a desire to reconnect. But I brushed it off. I told myself he was just figuring things out. And then came that phone call. Ethan had called me out of the blue about a week ago. He had just finished his shift and sounded a little distracted. I thought it was going to be a casual catch-up, but instead he hit me with something that left me stunned. He told me that he was looking at buying a condo and needed help with the down payment. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about this, and honestly, you owe it to me. You brought me into this world, right? You're my parent, so you should help me out." I froze, trying to process what I was hearing. Owe him? A down payment? What was he talking about? I tried to keep my voice calm. "Ethan, parenting doesn't mean buying grown kids their first home. I've already given you everything I could: love, support, guidance, but this is your responsibility now." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone was more accusatory. "That's cold, Mom. I've been working hard for this, and you just don't get it. I need this from you. You owe it to me." My heart sank. This was not the conversation I had expected. I told him I couldn't do it, that I wasn't going to enable him like this. The conversation ended on a sour note, and as I hung up, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. It wasn't just about the money, it was the audacity, the entitlement that came with that request. The fact that he had actually believed I owed him something because of what I had given him as a child. I didn't know how to feel: confused, hurt, but most of all, betrayed. For the first time in years, I blocked him. I needed him to understand, needed him to grasp the reality of what was happening. Maybe I was too harsh, but in that moment, I couldn't see another way. He had to learn gratitude. It's funny how one moment can shift everything. A single phone call, a few words, and suddenly, your world feels like it's been turned upside down. I'd always prided myself on being a good mother, selfless, reliable, and there for my kids whenever they needed me. Ethan, my son, was supposed to understand that. But this was beyond anything I could have anticipated. When Ethan called that afternoon, he sounded casual, but there was an edge in his voice that I couldn't place. He'd been quiet for a while, too quiet, if I'm being honest. In the last few months, his calls had dwindled, and the visits had become more like a ticking box on his to-do list. But that day, he had something on his mind, and I was about to find out exactly what it was. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice sounding a little distracted, like he was weighing his words carefully. "So I'm looking at this condo. It's a nice place, really, but I'm gonna need some help with the down payment. Do you think you can help me out?" I felt a tightness in my chest, like something was pressing down on me, but I pushed it aside. "A condo? That's great, Ethan. I'm happy you're looking into buying a place." I paused, waiting for him to explain, thinking maybe this was one of those adulting moments where he was finally making a responsible decision. But the next thing he said knocked the wind out of me. "You know," he continued, his voice a bit hesitant, but still with that strange sense of expectation, "I've been thinking about it, and honestly, you owe it to me. I mean, you brought me into this world, right? You're my parent, so you should help me out with this. A down payment for my first place is like the least you could do." I couldn't breathe for a second. The words hit me like a slap across the face, and for a few seconds I just sat there in stunned silence. I hadn't expected him to ask for money, certainly not like this, not like he was entitled to it. My thoughts were scrambling, racing to understand how he could possibly think this was something I owed him. "Ethan, I started, trying to compose myself. "I've always done my best for you. I've been there for you every step of the way, but parenting doesn't mean giving you money for a down payment on a house. You're an adult now. You need to figure this out yourself." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought he might argue back, but instead, there was a strange calmness to his next words. "That's cold, Mom. Honestly, I thought you'd understand. I've been working hard, and I deserve this. And you're just turning your back on me. That's pretty heartless." Heartless. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. I felt a wave of anger rising in me, but I forced it down, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "I'm not turning my back on you, Ethan. I just can't help you with this. You're an adult now. You need to take responsibility for your own life." He didn't respond immediately. The silence between us felt suffocating, like something was snapping. And when he finally spoke again, His tone had shifted. He wasn't angry anymore. He was disappointed. "You don't get it," he said softly, almost regretfully. "I just thought you'd be there for me. But I guess I was wrong." The disappointment in his voice cut deeper than any argument could have. I didn't know how to respond, because what I was hearing felt so foreign. Was this really Ethan, the boy I'd raised, the one I'd worked so hard for, who now believed that I owed him something as big as a down payment on his first home? "Maybe you're right," I finally said, my voice trembling a little. "Maybe I'm not the parent you thought I was. But this isn't about being a good parent, Ethan. This is about you growing up. You're an adult now, and you have to learn to take care of yourself." There was another long pause, and I could almost feel the emotional distance stretching between us. He was processing my words, but in that moment, it felt like we were worlds apart. Finally, I made a decision. "I need space right now. I can't talk about this anymore. I'm blocking you for a while until you think about what you've said to me. I'm not going to enable this entitlement." "Whatever, Mom," he shot back, his voice tinged with a bitterness I hadn't heard before. "You'll regret this." And just like that, the conversation ended. I blocked his number immediately. It was a decision I never thought I'd have to make, not with my son. But what else could I do? He had to learn gratitude, and I wasn't going to be the one to hand him everything on a silver platter just because he thought I owed him something. As I sat there, staring at my phone, the weight of the moment sank in. I was shaken, but at the same time, something inside me felt clear. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me into giving him what he wanted. Not this time. He had to grow up, and if that meant tough love, then so be it. I didn't know how long it would take, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't backing down. The days that followed felt like an emotional tug of war. I didn't know if I'd done the right thing by blocking Ethan. The silence between us was suffocating. There was a pit in my stomach that wouldn't go away, no matter how many distractions I tried to throw at it. Work was hectic, as always, and Jamie, my younger daughter, was being her usual whirlwind self, full of energy, questions, and never-ending chatter. But even with all of that, the emptiness in the house was undeniable. Ethan was always there, even if it was just for a few minutes at a time. But now, it felt like something was missing. I tried to tell myself that this was temporary, that he needed time to reflect on what had happened, to process it, to understand that I wasn't rejecting him, I was teaching him a lesson. But the longer I went without hearing from him, the more my mind spiraled into doubt. Was I being too harsh? Should I have been more understanding? Was this really about the money, or was it something deeper, something I'd failed to see? The first few days after I blocked him, I resisted the urge to reach out. There was part of me that wanted to apologize, to make things right, but I knew deep down that I couldn't. This wasn't about making things right for me, it was about him understanding that he couldn't manipulate me into giving him what he wanted, that he had to take responsibility for his own life. I wasn't doing him any favors by caving into his demands. Then a week passed. Nothing. No calls, no texts, nothing. That's when I started to feel the loneliness creeping in, like a slow poison. I couldn't help but wonder if this was how it was going to be from now on. Silence, resentment, a growing distance between us. I'd heard about other parents who had similar experiences with their kids, but it never seemed like it would happen to me. Ethan had always been close to me, even when things weren't perfect. But now I felt like I had lost him. Not just emotionally, but in every way that mattered. The second week, I tried to keep busy. I threw myself into work, cleaning, organizing anything to keep my mind occupied. But it didn't work. The emptiness was still there. I thought about him constantly. Was he really okay? Was he struggling with the decision I'd made? Was he angry? I hated not knowing, but at the same time, I knew that this space was something we both needed. He needed to come to terms with what had happened, and I needed to give myself permission to stand firm no matter how much it hurt. That's when I got the first sign that maybe I wasn't as invisible to him as I thought. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine, when my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat. and I nearly dropped the magazine. I thought maybe it was him. Maybe he'd finally reached out. But it wasn't Ethan. It was my sister, Mel. "Hey, have you talked to Ethan lately?" she asked. I frowned. "Not since the conversation we had." "Why?" "He's been talking to me," she said, her tone cautious. "He's really upset, and he feels like you've abandoned him. He's been saying some things that don't sound like him. He thinks you're punishing him for something he didn't do." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean, punishing him for something he didn't do?" "He asked me for a down payment on a condo, Mel. A down payment, like I'm supposed to just hand him money because I brought him into this world. I told him no, and he didn't take it well, so I blocked him." "I don't think that's a punishment. That's just me setting boundaries." I could hear Mel sigh on the other end. "I get it, I really do. But you've got to know, he feels completely blindsided. He doesn't understand why you're doing this. He thinks you're supposed to support him, especially now that he's trying to get his life together. He feels like you're not there for him when he needs you." "Is that what he's telling people?" I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "That I'm not there for him? What about all the times I've been there for him? What about all the years I sacrificed for him? And now, because I don't give him what he wants, I'm the bad guy?" Mel's voice softened. "I know you've done a lot for him, but maybe this is about more than the condo. Maybe he's feeling like he's not enough, that you're not proud of him, that he has to do everything on his own to get your approval. Maybe he doesn't know how to ask for help in a way that feels less entitled." I sat back, letting her words sink in. I'd never considered that angle before. Had I really given Ethan the impression that I only valued him when he succeeded, when he checked all the boxes? Maybe there had been times when I focused too much on what he wasn't doing, on what he hadn't achieved, rather than celebrating the small wins, the things he had done well. But still, the request was outrageous. And no matter how much I tried to justify his feelings, it didn't change the fact that he had crossed a line. He wasn't entitled to anything from me, not like this. "I get that he's struggling," I said, my voice tight, "but he has to learn that life isn't just about taking and expecting others to fix things for him. He's an adult now, and that's what I'm trying to teach him, even if it means hurting him in the process." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Mel spoke again, her voice filled with concern. "I just think you need to be careful. The more you shut him out, the more it might drive a wedge between you. I get where you're coming from, I do. But don't let this be the thing that breaks your relationship." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. I knew she was right in a way. The last thing I wanted was to drive a wedge between us for good. But I couldn't just back down, not when I was trying to teach him something important. "I'll figure it out," I said, a little more sharply than I intended. "But right now, I need him to figure it out. He can't keep thinking I'll be there to solve all his problems." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was being too harsh. I didn't know how long it would take for Ethan to come around, or if he ever would. The thought of losing him hurt in ways I couldn't even put into words, but I kept telling myself that this was the right thing to do. He had to grow up. He had to learn that life wasn't just about taking and taking. There had to be a balance. But deep down, a quiet voice kept whispering that maybe, just maybe, I was losing him in ways I didn't fully understand yet. The day Ethan finally reached out wasn't the one I had imagined. It wasn't an emotional phone call or a tearful apology. No, this time it came in the form of a text, just a simple message that read, "Can we talk? I know I screwed up." At first, I stared at my phone, unsure of what to feel. It had been nearly a month since I'd blocked him. In that time, the silence had stretched between us like a canyon deep, wide, and impossible to bridge. I'd thought about him every day, but I never once gave in to the temptation to reach out. Not because I was angry, but because I believed this was the only way he'd understand. The only way he'd finally grasp what I had tried to teach him about responsibility, entitlement, and gratitude. I didn't respond right away. I knew he'd been hurt, but I had been hurt too, and this was a process for both of us. He needed to learn that boundaries were as important as love, but after sitting with it for a few moments, I typed a simple reply. Okay. It felt surreal, like stepping into an unfamiliar room after years of avoiding it. I had no idea where this conversation would go, but I was ready. For better or worse, I was ready. Ethan called within minutes. I could hear the tension in his voice before I even said hello. "Mom," he started, his voice shaky but firm. "I've been thinking about everything, about what I said, about what you said. I get it now, I really do." I took a deep breath, letting his words settle in before responding. "What do you get, Ethan?" There was a pause, followed by a sigh that seemed to carry all the weight of the past few weeks. "I get that you weren't trying to punish me. I get that you've always been there for me, and I've taken that for granted. I was mad because I felt like I was doing everything on my own, and I thought I needed you to help me take that next step. But I was wrong. You were right. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. Hearing him admit that felt like a victory, but it wasn't the one I had expected. I wanted to hear the words, "I'm sorry." I needed to hear them, to feel that sense of closure and validation. But instead, what I got was something just as powerful. He wasn't just admitting he was wrong, he was changing. Finally, after everything, he was changing. "You don't need to apologize to me, Ethan," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "But I need you to understand that this was never about me abandoning you. It was about me not enabling you anymore. I've always given you everything I had, but you're not a kid anymore. You're an adult. It's time to take responsibility for your own life." He was quiet for a moment, processing my words, before he spoke again. "I was scared that I wouldn't make it without you. I thought I needed you to fix everything for me, like I always thought you could. But I see now that I was holding myself back by depending on you." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a weight lift off my chest. I had spent so many nights lying awake, wondering if he'd ever truly understand. But hearing him say those words made everything feel worth it. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, but you're learning. That's what matters." And then he said something I didn't expect. "I've been looking at places. I found a place I can afford, with roommates. I'm going to make it work. I won't ask you for anything again. I promise." My heart swelled with pride, but it was also mixed with a tinge of sadness. This was the moment I had been preparing for, but I wasn't ready to let go. Not completely. I had spent so many years nurturing him, protecting him from the hard truths of life, and now I was being forced to let him go, to let him grow up. "Good," I said, my voice steady now. "But just remember, life's not about doing it alone either. It's about finding the balance. You don't have to do everything by yourself, but you also have to know when to ask for help and when to stand on your own." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. "I know, Mom, and I promise I won't forget it." After that, the conversation flowed more easily. We talked about his new place, about the work he'd been putting into saving for the move, and about the steps he was taking to build the future he wanted. It felt like the conversation we should have had weeks ago, but I understood that sometimes people needed time to come to terms with their own shortcomings. As we ended the call, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The anger that had simmered in me for weeks had dissolved, and all that was left was a quiet understanding. Ethan had learned a lesson, and so had I. It wasn't about being right or wrong, it was about giving each other the space to grow, even when it hurt. As I put down my phone, I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when my son finally took responsibility for his own life. The moment when I could stop being his crutch and start being his guide. But the most important lesson I had learned was one that I didn't expect to find in all of this. Sometimes the hardest thing to do as a mother is to let go. Let go of the idea that you can fix everything for them. Let go of the belief that they need you to carry them through life. Let go of the fear that they won't make it without you. And in that moment, I finally let go. The weeks that followed were quieter than I'd expected, but they were also filled with a sense of resolution that was long overdue. Ethan's apology wasn't grand or dramatic. It wasn't even really about the condo anymore. What mattered was that he had understood something deeper. Something I hadn't realized was at the core of all this. He wasn't just asking for money, he had been asking for validation, for reassurance that he was doing enough to be proud of. He had wanted me to believe in him the way I always had, but in his mind, that belief was only tied to tangible things. The condo, the money, the support. It wasn't about the material, it was about feeling seen. I started to see him differently after that conversation. Not just as my son, but as a young man who was starting to carve out his own path. It wasn't always easy for me to let go of the motherly instinct to protect him, to step in when I thought he needed me. But with each passing day, I saw the small changes in him, the way he handled his finances more responsibly, how he began to take pride in his work, how he no longer expected his happiness to come from others. The first time I saw him again after that call, it was on his terms. He invited me over to the new condo. He'd kept his promise, even without asking for anything from me. The place wasn't much, a small, modest unit with a few mismatched pieces of furniture, but it was his. He'd done it, on his own. I walked in, taking in the space. It wasn't glamorous, but there was something beautiful about it. The bare walls, the unfinished edges, the cluttered countertops. It was him. This was where he was building his future, and it wasn't perfect, but it was his. And that was enough. "Mom," he said, a little shy, but with a smile that was genuine, "I know it's not much, but I wanted you to see it. It's mine. I'm really proud of it." I could hear the pride in his voice, the one I had been waiting for him to find. It was a quiet victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. "I'm proud of you too, Ethan," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "This is your first step, and I'm happy for you. This is just the beginning." He nodded, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time himself. "Yeah, it feels different, but in a good way, you know? It's hard, but it's real. I'm learning what it means to stand on my own." And in that moment, I realized just how much he had grown, maybe more than I had realized. The road hadn't been easy for either of us, but we had made it through. He had learned the lesson I had been trying to teach him, and in doing so, he had unknowingly taught me something in return. It wasn't just about helping him with money or shelter. It was about empowering him to create his own life, to take ownership of his decisions, and to realize that his worth wasn't tied to anything I could give him. It was about understanding that I couldn't always be there to fix things, but that I had given him the tools to fix them himself. We spent the afternoon talking, catching up on everything from his job to his new plans for the future. The old tension between us had melted away, replaced with a newfound respect. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page. I could see him as the adult he was becoming, and not just the child I had once raised. As I left the condo that day, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I no longer felt the need to hover or to push him into the next phase of his life. He was already there, taking the steps on his own. I had done my part, and now it was up to him to continue on his journey. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized something important. This whole ordeal had been a turning point. Not just for Ethan, but for me too. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to the past, trying to make sure everyone around me was taken care of, that I had forgotten to take care of myself. But in letting go, in trusting him to figure things out on his own, I had found a sense of strength I didn't even know I had. I hadn't just let go of Ethan, I had let go of the need to control everything. And in doing so, I had found peace. The phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Ethan. "Thanks for believing in me. I know I didn't make it easy, but I'm getting there. One step at a time." My heart swelled and I smiled. It was the simplest thing, but it was everything. I'll always believe in you, Ethan, no matter what. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from my shoulders. Maybe we hadn't come out of this unscathed, but we had both come out of it stronger, and that was all I needed to know. I could finally breathe again.